What's up, listeners?
And welcome back to the Beths Book Podcast. I'm Jack.
And I'm Jacob. In this episode, we're going to have book suggestions, book reviews, to be read, poll answers, and more.
So now, let's dive into this amazing podcast.
Indeed.
The topic for this episode is the medieval period. As you know, in the live Beths Book Podcast, we talk in general about each period. But now we'd like to go through them in a bit more detail. So we'll be starting with the medieval period.
The medieval period was from 800 AD to 1600 AD. The English language back then had many Anglo-Saxon influences, and it plays to instruct on the illiterate masses in morals and religion. Stories about knights and their chivalry codes of honor were very common back then.
Writers from back then were Geoffrey Chaucer, who wrote the Canterbury Tales, and Thomas Malory, who wrote the Morte d'Arthur.
And now, on to the book recommendations.
So, Finley, what are your book suggestions for this Beth's Book Podcast?
My suggestion is the horrible histories book, Dark Knights and Dingy Castles. It covers every aspect of medieval life, from buildings to battles, and tournaments to tales. It's one of my favourite books in the series. It's so funny.
Interesting indeed, Finley. My book suggestion of this Beth's Book Podcast is The Witcher, a legendary series that many of you may have heard. It entails a story of Geralt, a slayer of evil and monsters in a world of sorcery and magic. It is set in a medieval era where Geralt finds a girl called Ciri, who is apparently the child of destiny and who is destined to change the world.
Wow, that sounds incredible!
Yeah, I agree. It's my favorite book of all time.
And now for the poll results.
In third place is 1000 to 1200 AD, with a grand total of 16%.
In second place is 1400 AD to 1600 AD, with a grand total of 28%.
And in first place is 1200 to 1400 AD, with a grand total of 43%.
A massive thank you to everyone who participated in the poll, and make sure to be ready for even more like this.
Next, we have the interview. Firstly, we have Miss Stevens.
Miss Stevens, what interests you about this time period, and would you like to tell us some interesting facts?
So what interests me about medieval literature is the fact that it is the very first forming of literature in the written form. Prior to this, medieval literature and stories that are shared at the time are shared through the oral tradition, meaning that the stories and folk tales that we are aware of are ones that are shared through communicating with each other verbally, as opposed to reading stories in the way that we are very much more familiar with now in the modern day.
Okay. And would you like to tell us any book suggestions for this time period?
So I have read Geoffrey Chaucer's The Canterbury Tales. Geoffrey Chaucer is the first considered poet within English literature, and in the Canterbury Tales he has a number of different stories in long poems that he captures a sort of insight into the medieval period of life and the way in which people ran their lives at that time. So that is something that I would recommend that you look at if you are interested in embarking your development of knowledge in medieval literature.
So this would also help us with our current topic of poetry, which we're learning in English right now.
It absolutely would, and actually one of the first lessons that you have in poetry does give you a section of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales where you see, the very beginning, the very origin of poetry in its most base form.
Wow. And how do you think it influenced literature right now?
So obviously, in what I said earlier about it being the very first form of written communication, if you look at the traditional original texts of Chaucer and other medieval writers at the time, you would not be able to recognise all of them in terms of the language that's being used. So what you can see within medieval literature is that the written words appear very different to the language that we use and write in today. So in terms of how it has influenced literature, back then it would have been very much about the kind of vernacular and accents of your language, and that would be captured in the writing. Whereas today we use standard English. And so in terms of its influence, I would say core ideas and themes we still very much see in writing today, but also we're tracking the changes and developments of the English language within that as well.
It's very interesting this, because honestly my favourite period is also the medieval.
Brilliant.
Like to contrast, I imagine it's the Victorian era with Charles Dickens' books.
So quite a few hundred years in the future then, by comparison.
Yes, miss.
Okay, well thank you very much for having me on today's podcast, guys.
You're welcome, miss.
Thank you for spending your time with us.
Now for our next interview, we have Miss Minkovic, who will be answering 3 questions that we made. So firstly, what interests you about this time period, and do you know any interesting facts about it?
I think I find it a really interesting literary period and period of history, because in the grand scheme of things we know very little about it, and something that I know and I always find really interesting and surprising is that up until the reign of Edward III, the language that most people spoke in terms of upper class people, and therefore most people wrote or created in, was actually French. And it wasn't until Edward III that people started to write things and started to write them in English. And obviously that is something really important to English literature, but actually it's relatively recent.
Oh wow, I actually didn't know most of that. So the next question, do you have any book suggestions to read from the medieval time period?
I'm sure everybody knows about Geoffrey Chaucer, which I think is, the perfect example, and is a great example of how even though you have a book that is, or books or stories which are, hundreds of years old, they are still able to entertain us and talk about things that we understand and about, life experiences that we go through, joy, love, heartbreak, anger, things like that. But there's also John Gower and William Langland. But I think the thing you got to remember really with these books is that even though they are starting to speak in English, whereas they used to be spoken in French, it's obviously quite a different kind of English. And I remember at university, my friend did a module in Chaucer, and she was given a dictionary, so a separate dictionary to read Chaucer, which I always find quite interesting and quite funny.
That's nice. Now the last question. How do you think the medieval period influenced literature?
I think it had a huge influence. One, in terms of it being, like I said, that pivotal moment where, it's basically the beginning of literature as we know it. But also, if you think about probably the next, big name in literature would have been William Shakespeare. And even though he's writing 100 years later, and he's not really a medieval writer, his world and his understanding and his stories are really, really strongly located in that medieval period. And so I think even though we're separated through time, we're actually much closer in terms of literature to the medieval period than we think.
Wow, that's really nice having you here. Thank you for spending your time.
You're very welcome.
And with that, unfortunately, concludes our podcast. I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll be seeing you next month.